Hello, my name is Dr. James Farley, and this is episode 4 of Touch in the Past. Yes, you heard that correctly. This is finally episode 4, and I am really a doctor. No, not a doctor that can prescribe you medicine or do surgery, but a doctor who can write a lot of things about some stuff. And boy, do I have some stuff to tell you today. So, being that this podcast is still developing its sea legs of sorts in the world of podcasting, I decided to try my hand on a topic that some would consider the lowest hanging fruit of them all. True crime. Dun, dun, dun. Now, when you think high profile crime, like murder, for instance, you generally don't think of Metuchen. I mean, it's not exactly Whitechapel in the late 1800s, you know? However, well, that was a Jack the Ripper reference, so anyone who doesn't know it there. However, based on my research, there have been 5, count them, 5 murders in the over 100-year history of Metuchen. So today we are going to talk about murder number 3. And I picked murder number 3. Number 3 in part because as I'm recording this, Game 7 of the NBA Finals is upon us, which always makes me think of John Starks' legendary performance in 1994. But I picked 3 more so because the outcome of this case was so bizarre that I just had to discuss it with you. So with that, my friends, please jump back into our time machine, buckle your seatbelts, and get ready to travel into the past to explore the tragic murder of Mrs. Mariah Etta Terrell. So the story starts in Avera, Georgia, around the year 1900 with the birth of George L. Terrell. Now, while not a lot is publicly known about George's early childhood, we do know that 12 years later and 500 miles away, his future wife, Mariah Etta Terrell, was born in Amberg, Virginia. Mariah had 5 siblings, 2 sisters, and 3 brothers. She moved to the Metuchen area around 1926, while George moved to New Jersey in 1932. While it's unclear when they were officially married, the two bought a home together at 88 John Street in Carteret in the year 1943. Now, shortly after, the couple would move to Metuchen, making their home at 170 Central Avenue. While living there, and I have to give George Terrell credit for this because he was a very hardworking person by all accounts throughout most of his life. He was even very creative. So check this out. At 170 Central Avenue in Metuchen, he was able to open up a barber shop in his garage. Now, according to the Central New Jersey Home News, his initial request that was filed in May of 1946, was denied by the Metuchen Borough Council. So as stated by the Metuchen Borough Council meeting on May 20th, 1946, George Terrell failed to notify all of the property owners within 100 feet by mail that he intended to start his business. So the Borough Council encouraged him to reapply, and apply he did. So on Monday, July 1st, he received permission from the Metuchen Borough Council in conjunction with the zoning board to erect a two-car garage and a barber shop at his home on 170 Central Avenue in Metuchen, New Jersey, which is pretty cool. Like, that's a pretty ambitious and cool endeavor. So I give him credit from that. So from my research, George Terrell was an entrepreneur, ambitious and hardworking, as I said, throughout much of his life. However, this didn't make him a great driver. According to the Central New Jersey Home News on May 22nd, 1948, George Terrell was involved in a collision at Middlesex Avenue and Bridge Street that resulted in chest injuries for a Mrs. Ann Jacobson, a 70-year-old housekeeper at the Danish home that was on New Durham Road in Raritan Township. In George's defense, that turn at Middlesex and Bridge Street is really not a great turn. So I understand that accident right there. No judgment on him for that one. On December 20th, 1954, he accidentally rear-ended a woman named Jane L. Yan of on Middlesex Avenue, rather. And on May 4th, 1957, he was fined a whopping, that was a drum roll in case you didn't know. He was fined a whopping $15 for careless driving. So that doesn't seem like a lot. However, in 1957, that would be the equivalent today of a fine of about $178.33. So it was somewhat of a lofty fine back then. Now, from all accounts, his wife Mariah was much better at driving, as women tend to be. Let's be honest. She only experienced one accident based on my research, and it wasn't her fault, but rather the fault of a man. Dun, dun, dun. So on July 30th, 1954, Mrs. Mariah Etta Terrell's car was sideswiped by Vidal Sanitage, who left the scene of the crime. Typical male. No, I'm just kidding. I'm a male myself. I wouldn't throw us under the bus like that, but yep, females generally are better drivers, just the way it is. Anyway, as I digress, Mariah Etta Terrell, not a bad driver. Back to his home-based barbershop for George Terrell on 170 Central Avenue. It's not clear how successful the entrepreneurial endeavor was. At the very least, around 1950, George Terrell had to seek additional employment, which he found with the Union Carbine Corporation in Boundbrook. I looked this up because I didn't know what it was. Union Carbine, it's a company that produces chemicals and polymers, such as plastic, rubber, silk, wool. They make it for their customers, who then incorporate it into their goods, and they provide it to their customers. The stuff that was made at Union Carbine, I did look at the products that they made. And the final products that their things go into include paints, coatings, packaging, wire and cable, household products, personal care, pharmaceuticals, automotives, textiles, agriculture, and oil and gas. Why do you need to know this? Well, you don't. It really doesn't apply at all to this story. I just was interested in what Union Carbine Corporation was. Anyway, back to the story I had. So George went on to work at Union Carbine for 13 years, and he retired around 1963. As previously stated, I think I stated it 2 times actually before this. So stated 2 additional times before this, George Terrell was a hard worker, and at some point between receiving approval to build his home barbershop in 1946 and the year 1959, George Terrell opened an additional barbershop in New Brunswick, New Jersey. So his shop in New Brunswick was situated in front of a 3-room apartment on 328 State Street. Now, here is a terrible tragedy that I have to say George Terrell was not involved in any way, but I thought it was worth reporting in this episode. So a tragedy occurred on 328 State Street in 1959. So according to the news of Cumberland County, on December 1st, as 21-year-old Juanita Barte, her 2 infant children, and her niece and nephew slept, a kerosene stove in their apartment exploded. So people passing by reportedly heard 3 explosions, which caused the mother, Juanita, to wake up. She then immediately grabbed her daughter, 16-month-old Linda May, and rushed her to the street. Juanita then sprinted back into the blazing apartment to save her other children, but she was only able to recover her daughter, 3-month-old Cynthia Barte. She came back out of the apartment. Her hair was in flames. Her niece, Joyce Yvonne Good, age 4, and her nephew, Junior Good, age 2, perished in the fire. Although she was able to recover Cynthia Barte, she too perished upon arrival at the hospital. The explosion, as was reported, turned the small apartment into a blazing death trap that would take the lives of 3 young children. Now, George Terrell at the time was not in his barber shop, and like I said, he wasn't involved in this, but it was a tragic story that I just wanted to share on. So back to our story and where the plot really thickens as far as the incident of interest for us. On February 23rd, 1972, George Terrell took out a debt notice in the Central New Jersey Home News. This indicated that he would not be responsible for debts contracted by anyone other than himself. Now, I had to look this up because I wasn't 100% sure what it was. A debt notice, from what I understand, is to notify creditors who may have claims against an estate that someone has passed away. Mariah Terrell was not passed away at this point, so that was interesting. However, in this case, since it didn't indicate that anyone died, it just stated that he was responsible for the debts that he himself contracted. It's notable to say that this usually precedes a divorce. So you can infer that things were not going well between George and Mariah Terrell at this point. It should also be noted that according to Charge Debt Solutions, marital debts are not always cut and dry. So, for instance, debt that you've acquired with your spouse is the responsibility typically of both parties. So a house, even if it's in a person's name, may also be attributed to both parties based on individual financial situations. New Jersey does not currently require citizens to take out a debt notice, what I found out. But even in 1972, it likely would not have made a difference in whether or not he would have to pay debts that he did not directly acquire while in the midst of his marriage. So here's where the story really takes a morbid turn. A few months later, after taking out this debt notice, on April 13th, according to the Gloucester County Times, George Terrell reported his wife, Mariah Etta Terrell, missing to the Metuchen Police Department. 2 weeks later, on Saturday, April 29th, according to the Jersey Journal, the nude body of Mrs. Mariah Etta Terrell was recovered from the Newark Bay in Jersey City. At the time of the discovery, Mrs. Etta Terrell had a 6-foot coil of rope around her neck. Her body was identified by her sister, Ruby Cyrus. The Jersey City medical examiner said that the death was caused by strangulation. On May 3rd, 3 days after the discovery of Etta's body, George Terrell was notified by the Metuchen police to appear at police headquarters. George Terrell obliged, and upon arrival, he was arrested and charged with the murder of his wife, Mariah Etta Terrell. According to police, Mrs. Terrell was murdered in the couple's home at 170 Central Avenue on April 13, 1972. There was no indication of any sort of foul play until April 29th when her body was discovered. After George Terrell was taken into custody, he kept saying, "I did something wrong. It was wrong." Police warned him he should not talk without the benefit of legal counsel. However, Terrell eventually blurted out, "I choked her. I choked her." According to Terrell, on the night of April 13th, he and his wife had an argument over $25,000 that the couple had received from the sale of a property in Roselle, New Jersey. He said that his wife took the money and refused to give him his share. It should be noted, while it seems a bit small by today's standards, that in 1972, $25,000 would be the equivalent today of $147,416.21. So it was a rather large sum of money. During the argument between the couple, George Terrell explained that he knocked his wife Mariah down to the ground and began strangling her. He stated that he had no control over himself while doing this. After he killed his wife, George Terrell removed Mariah's clothes, wrapped her body in a blanket, carried her to his car. He drove aimlessly toward and around Newark when he finally decided to dump her body off a bridge. According to George Terrell, he used a piece of clothesline to lower the body from the edge of the bridge into the water. He said passing motorists probably did not see him as he removed the body from the car and lowered it over the side of the bridge. Also, on May 3rd, after being charged with the murder, he was sent to Middlesex County Jail, where get this, where he was released later that day on, here's my drums again, a $5,000 bail. That's right. He was released from Middlesex County Jail the same day that he was charged with the murder of his wife on a $5,000 bail. Now, bail, which was set by Judge John E. Bachman, $5,000 bail in today's terms or today's equivalent would be almost $37,000. But still, that seems quite low for a murder that seemed to have a motive. And I just don't understand the leniency there. But hey, it is what it is, I guess. Anyway, back to our story. Mariah Etta Terrell's funeral took place on Friday, May 5th at the Anderson Funeral Home in New Brunswick. She was buried in Franklin Memorial Park in North Brunswick. Her obituary was published in the Courier News 2 days after her husband, George, was charged with her murder. Now, what's odd is that the obituary listed her husband, George, as one of the survivors, or one of her survivors. But obituaries are typically created by family members of the deceased. And in the case of murder or a suspected murder, the primary suspect is not usually named as one of the victim's survivors, even if they are married. So I thought that was interesting. It does mention that he was suspected of the crime, but still to be listed in the survivors, I thought was kind of odd to me. Nevertheless, on October 2nd, George Terrell waived his right to a trial on the charge of murdering his wife. And this blows my mind. Just a quick warning here. Instead of the charge of murder, he waived his right to a trial, and he pled to the downgraded charge of manslaughter. That's right, manslaughter. The plea was entered before District Court Judge John Stratmos. Now, Judge Stratmos was also in charge of imposing Terrell's sentence. The assistant prosecutor, who I would think would be a little unhappy with this plea, especially when you had a confession. But the assistant prosecutor, Jerome Convery, told the court that the state had no objection to the plea, which carried a maximum sentence of 10 years. A maximum sentence of 10 years. I mean, he had a motive. He murdered his wife. He got rid of the body. He reported her missing. And then he was charged before confessing. I don't know how this can be considered manslaughter, but we're going to go into that a little bit. So my problem is that according to the website of the Law Office of Douglas Herring, murder occurs when a person knowingly or purposefully kills another person or inflicts substantial bodily harm that results in death. Now, the charge of first-degree murder usually requires planning, while murder in the second degree typically involves a reckless act without the planning. Mariah Etta Terrell's cause of death was strangulation. And, strangulation, from what I understand, constricts the jugular veins and carotid arteries, and it can result in the loss of consciousness in as little as 10 seconds, which is relatively quick. But brain death does not begin to occur until about 4 to 5 minutes. So after she passes out, George Terrell continues to strangle her unconscious body for an additional 3 to 4 minutes and 50 seconds. It just doesn't do me. I don't understand. Do me a favor. Pause this, or after you listen, just sit quietly for a minute. Just 60 seconds. Time it. You're going to see that 60 seconds is a lot longer than you think. Now, do that for 4 times as long. So that's how long George Terrell strangled his wife. He had no control during that duration of strangulation. I find that very hard to believe. Also, according to the website for the Law Office of Douglas Herring, obviously you can tell I linked this website, manslaughter is typically used when a murder occurs without an intent to kill on the part of the perpetrator. However, for murders that occur in the heat of passion due to reasonable provocation, the perpetrator may be more guilty of manslaughter than murder in the first or second degree. So I guess here's where the waters get a little bit muddy, because it says it should be noted that for this charge to be used as far as heat of passion, the provocation must be so egregious that it would cause an ordinary reasonable person, which, George Terrell up to this point did seem ordinary and reasonable from all my research. It would cause them to inflict injuries that would result in a fatality. So an ordinary person would be so agitated by something so horrible that it would cause them to basically, lose control of themselves. Which I guess, I don't know. I still have a hard time to understand this one. In New Jersey, manslaughter charges generally fall under three categories from what I found. There's aggravated manslaughter, reckless manslaughter, and then passion and provocation manslaughter, which I guess passion and provocation manslaughter, which is considered a second-degree crime. I guess you could possibly argue that George Terrell's crime would fall under this, this label. But in New Jersey, currently, that crime carries a sentence from 10 to 20 years. 20 years definitely being a lot more reasonable, but still for murder and murdering your wife, I don't know. It should be noted that in the 1970s, judicial systems heavily pushed the need for rehabilitation as opposed to stiff prison sentences. In New Jersey, like many states, New Jersey used an indeterminate sentencing system, which resulted in judge imposing broad sentence ranges. And then after the minimum was served, a parole board would determine whether or not the person should be released. This is in contrast to the more widely used determinate system that is more widely used today, where someone receives a fixed penalty for, say, 10 years, and there's no parole hearing to determine if an early release should occur. Also in the 70s, judges had a wide latitude with sentence ranges, and prisons nationwide, from what I understand, were struggling with a major problem of overcrowding. So, George Terrell being in his 70s, maybe they found it in them to, accept this plea and move on with the case. And, again, I continue. Therefore, taking all this into account, on November 21st, the now 72-year-old George Terrell was sentenced by Judge C. Stratmos to 2 to 4 years in Trenton's New Jersey State Prison for killing his wife. 2 to 4 years! 2 to 4 years for killing his wife. I don't know. I don't know whether to be outraged or what. I'm just so baffled by this. An interesting side note. So, in a story printed, in a side story, when this came out, it was printed in the Courier News. So, in a story printed adjacent to the one that explained that George Terrell was given 2 to 4 years for murdering his wife, in the adjacent article, it talked about a 24-year-old person named Rochelle Urey of Plainfield, and how they were sentenced to 5 to 7 years in New Jersey State Prison for armed robbery of the Coral Lounge on 2000 Park Avenue in South Plainfield. They also robbed Kane's Liquor Store and Grand Union Shopping Center, which all of them were in South Plainfield. So I'm not saying that's good. Armed robbery, certainly bad, but armed robbery got 5 to 7 years, and murdering your wife when there was a money motive, 2 to 4? I don't know. New Jersey, you dropped the ball on this one. A month after his sentencing, George Terrell became mentally ill, and he was transferred from New Jersey State Prison to the Vroom Building, which is a story in and of itself, the Vroom Building, but we can't get into that now. The Vroom Building, which is a wing at the Trenton Psychiatric Hospital for the criminally insane. When I hear that, I think of like a Batman. I think of like Arkham Asylum with like the Joker and the Penguin and I don't know. I just get, or the Silence of the Lambs kind of vibe where you just have a row of criminals looking at you, and you have Hannibal Lecter and good movie by the way. Anthony Hopkins, great actor. Anyway, back to the story. So shortly after this, he was transferred to Marlborough. Wow, I have trouble saying that. Marlborough Psychiatric Hospital in Marlborough, New Jersey, and he was discharged on May 17th, 1974. Collectively, and I know he's older, and I know the 70s was a little bit more lax on crime and punishment, but collectively, George Terrell served just a hair under a year and a half in prison for the murder of his wife. For the murder of his wife. A year and a half in prison. I think I read a story once about jaywalkers who received a little bit more than that for jaywalking on moderately busy. No, I'm making that up. I was gonna say moderately busy highways, but that's not true. It's just a mind-blowing. It's a mind-blowing sentence for such a terrible crime. So George Terrell was released, and a few years later, in 1976. There was on October 15th, 1976, to be exact, there was a half-day trial in the Chancery Division of the Superior Court with a Judge David Furman, who ruled that the home and property of the former home and property, rather, of Mariah, Etta Terrell and George Terrell on 170 Central Ave in Metuchen must go to the niece, Sylvia, and nephew, John Cyrus, though they were the niece and nephew of Mariah, Etta Terrell. So the judge ruled that the home had to go to them. Now, the house that went to the niece and nephew, it was assessed in 1976 at $45,000 with an estimated market value of $50,000. In Metuchen, a house in 1976 worth $50,000 on market value could be worth, get Metuchen in the real estate, could be worth over 800. I can't say it. Sorry, I was so taken aback by this price that it's crazy. It could be worth over $800,000 today. So this was a very big ruling. Furman ruled that George Terrell was entitled to a small lien on the property, which the amount was determined in a case conference between the opposing lawyers. In this case, Terrell was represented by a Mr. Fred Klein, who was an attorney from Perth Amboy. Klein attempted to see if Terrell could possibly continue living over at 170 Central Avenue. And what I thought was pretty fascinating was that there was actually preliminary discussions with Mrs. Ruby Cyrus, the sister of Mariah, Etta Terrell, who actually had to be responsible for identifying her body, if you remember. And she was the executor of Mariah's will. There were preliminary discussions where she might actually consider allowing George Terrell to continue to live in the house where he murdered Mariah until death, which I believe in live and let live, but I thought that was interesting that the sister would be willing, the sister of the deceased Mariah would be willing to make such a compromise, but I guess that is their business. In 1977, so shortly after the decision on the house was made, George Terrell ended up moving to 95 Remisen Avenue in New Brunswick. And sometime in 1977, or possibly a little bit before that, George Terrell did end up getting married. And On November 6, 1977, George Terrell passed away at the age of 77 in St. Peter's Medical Center. He was buried in Franklin Memorial Park in North Brunswick. So, what confuses me most about this case, aside from the insanely lean sentence that George Terrell received for murdering his wife, is the relationship between Mariah Terrell's family and George Terrell. So, for instance, there were no articles concerning outrage towards George Terrell's ridiculously short sentence or his early release. Nor did they staunchly oppose his transition back into the house where he murdered their loved one. It said supposedly they were somewhat open to the idea, which I just don't understand at all. But, all that being said, everyone grieves in different ways, and we can't be sure how they felt as the events were unfolding. But one thing that was certain, I want to point out, Mariah Etta Terrell was very much missed by her family. In 1973, her family members, 1973, on April 29th, her family members, General, Periel, Ruby, Lawrence, and Edward, posted a poem in the in memoriam section of the Central Jersey Home News. And it read, "You're not forgotten, sister dear, nor will you ever be. As long as life and memory last, we shall remember thee." So I thought that was really nice. And, it was certainly a tragic story. I certainly respect Mariah Terrell's family for honoring her passing, and while also seemingly to move towards forgiveness to try and move on with her life. But I think it shows that the strong people that they are, the strong family that they are, and I think that's excellent. But definitely a tragic story. We would like to dedicate this episode to the memory of Mariah Etta Terrell. I want to thank everybody for listening to this episode. A little bit of a heavy topic, but wanted to explore it a little bit. And the next episode, I believe we're going to return with we have an interview lined up. It's all ready to go, so hopefully we get that to you soon. We'll try to make these episodes come out a little bit quicker. If you want to catch up with the past of Metuchen, you have something to listen to more frequently. So that being said, thank you everybody very much for listening. Again, I am Dr. James Farley, and hope you guys have a good day, good weekend, and I'll talk to you soon. All right, take care. Bye.